Hello, my name is Emily Weaver, and we're going to be discussing comprehensive reading today. Comprehensive reading is an important aspect in 12th grade English because it helps a reader understand the intended message in the text and analyze the important factors provided. Alright, so hopefully these are all going to be terms you have already learned or at least heard about in previous classes. So the definition of plot is the sequence of events that tells the story. The conflict of a text is an issue with which the story revolves. The mood is the general atmosphere of a narrative, and the theme is the central idea or concept of the story. These are all very important terms to remember when reading in order to obtain the full true meaning behind a text. We are now going to discuss common literary techniques. Literary techniques are not intended to further the author's purpose, but rather to ensure the comprehension and appreciation of the reader. The first literary technique we're going to be talking about is imagery. Imagery is when the author creates visual representation in text that appeals to our physical senses. The idea of imagery is to put the reader into the text so they can taste, see, smell, touch, or hear as if the reader is in that setting. Some further examples of imagery is the night was dark and gloomy, or the river was roaring in the mountains. Dark, gloomy, and roaring are all examples of the author trying to use imagery to input the reader into the setting. The second literary technique we're going to be talking about is hyperbole. A hyperbole is an exaggeration of actions or ideas to emphasize a point or message in a text. The hyperbole is important because the author is trying to get the reader to understand the situation by exaggerating the circumstances. An additional example of a hyperbole is, I've got a million reasons not to go. Million reasons is obviously an exaggeration. The third and fourth techniques we are focusing on are similes and metaphors. A simile is when the author compares two distinct objects using like or as, and the metaphor is pretty much the same thing except the author does not use the words like or as. The author uses these devices to draw comparisons between two distinct objects. This is yet another way for the author to emphasize a message in the text or the overall point of the given phrase. This also makes the writing a little bit more interesting and poetic. Some further examples of a simile and a metaphor are, my love is like a red rose, which is a simile, and he is an old fox, very cunning, is a metaphor. The fifth technique is personification. Personification is when the author gives human-like qualities to a non-human object. This is another way for an author to make his or her descriptions more interesting and vivid. Some more examples are, the flowers are dancing in the field, and have you seen my new car? She's a real beauty. Alliteration is when the consonant sounds repeat throughout a short sentence or text. An author of a text can use alliteration to make reading more rhythmic for the intended audience. Additionally, alliteration also sets the mood for a passage and can provide a negative or positive connotation. This is similar to an onomatopoeia, which appeals to the sense of sound. The seventh and final technique we'll be discussing is irony. I know most of you have at least heard of irony before, but it is one of the most common literary techniques, so it is important to make sure you can all understand it and realize it in a text. Irony is the use of words that seem to give one meaning but actually mean another. And there are three types of irony. There's verbal, dramatic, and situational. Verbal irony is speech that is said when a person says something but clearly means the opposite. An example of that is, oh, it's so great how you scratched my car. Dramatic irony is when the reader knows more than the characters in a text. This is often used to create suspense in a text and provide a sort of foreshadowing to the reader. A common user of dramatic irony is Shakespeare in his plays. The last type of irony is situational irony, which is when the outcome is different than expected. This is often used to mainly teach lessons provided in the main message in the text. Okay, I want everyone to pause the video now, and I want you to go and fill out and submit the Google form that I provided for you. And then once you've completed that, I want you to go ahead and finish the rest of this video. One of the main things we're going to focus on in this unit is finding the plot in a story. I've listed 5 things that are essential when trying to find the plot, and I'm going to describe them all now. The first step in finding the plot is to identify the exposition. This consists of noting the main characters and the setting. This is important because we are able to identify where and when the story is taking place and who will most likely be involved in the conflict. The second thing you have to consider is the rising action, or the events leading up to the main conflict in the story. What to focus on in this step would be the problems that the main protagonist comes across, like any obstacles that he comes face to face with. The climax or turning point of a story is when the protagonist and antagonist come face to face. More often than not, the main conflict consists of an ethical or moral dilemma that the protagonist must face. When you're considering the events leading up to the conclusion, or the falling action, these are the results of the main character's dilemma. This is when everything is winding down from the main conflict. The last thing you should do is to identify the resolution. The problems should all be solved and the story should draw to a close. Looking back at the main conflict, ask yourself if it was solved. If it was, how was it solved? Thank you for listening and paying attention. Please come to class tomorrow prepared with any questions you may have for me. Afterwards, we're going to look at literary techniques, devices, and plots in literature, and you must be able to label the elements and summarize the plot. Thanks, and I'll see you guys all tomorrow.